Born into the shadow of Maryland's eastern shore around 1818, the boy first known as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey entered a world designed to deny him a past, a future, and even a basic sense of self. Like many born into the machinery of American chattel slavery, his exact birth date was a mystery kept from him, a deliberate act of erasure intended to align his existence more with livestock than humanity. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was a distant figure who would walk 12 miles under the cover of night just to hold him briefly before trekking back to her own forced labor before dawn. These fleeting nocturnal reunions formed his earliest understanding of love, framed entirely by the cruelty of its impending loss. The landscape of his youth was the Great House Farm, the central plantation of Colonel Edward Lloyd. To a child's eyes, the plantation was a kingdom of contradictions, vast, fertile, and wealthy, yet governed by the whip and the terrifying screams of his Aunt Hester, whose brutal beatings provided Frederick's first traumatic realization of what it meant to be property. On this estate, he witnessed the psychological architecture of the slave system. The songs sung by the enslaved, often mistaken by white observers as expressions of happiness, were revealed to his keen ears as deep, melodic prayers of anguish. The turning point of his young life came not from a physical blow, but from a change in geography. At the age of 8, he was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld. The city offered a stark contrast to the rural plantation. The air was different, the oversight was less total, and it was here that the forbidden door of literacy began to crack open. Sophia Auld, never having owned a slave before, initially treated Frederick with a degree of natural human kindness, beginning to teach him the alphabet. However, the intervention of her husband, who sternly warned that learning would spoil the best nigger in the world, served as Frederick's second great awakening. In that moment of prohibition, he discovered the white man's power to enslave the black man. He realized then that if the masters feared a literate slave, then the book was the ultimate weapon of liberation. In the cobblestone streets of Baltimore, the young Frederick discovered that while the city offered more physical breathing room than the plantation, the mental chains remained heavy. Following Hugh Auld's prohibition of his education, Frederick was forced to become a strategist of his own enlightenment. He carried bread in his pockets, not just for sustenance, but as a currency to trade with impoverished white neighborhood boys in exchange for lessons in spelling and grammar. Using the fences and brick walls of the shipyard as his chalkboard and stray bits of chalk as his pen, he treated every discarded newspaper and street sign as a sacred text. At the age of 13, he purchased a copy of the Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches that introduced him to the concepts of natural rights and social justice. The words within gave a formal shape to his silent internal rebellion. He was no longer just a victim of a system, but an intellectual adversary to it. However, his intellectual awakening soon collided with a brutal physical reality. In 1833, following a dispute over property among his masters, Frederick was sent back to the countryside to labor for Thomas Auld. Finding Frederick unmanageable due to his literacy and independent spirit, Auld leased him out for 1 year to Edward Covey, a local farmer notorious as a slave breaker. Covey was a specialist in psychological and physical devastation. Under his watch, Frederick was worked to the point of exhaustion in the woods and fields, frequently beaten for the smallest perceived infractions. Within 6 months, the spark of his intellect seemed extinguished. He later described this period as the lowest point of his existence, stating that his intellectual family had been starved and his disposition to read vanished. The climax of this ordeal arrived on a scorching August day. After a particularly savage beating that left Frederick bleeding and weak, Covey attempted to tie him up for further punishment. In a moment of transcendent defiance, Frederick decided to fight back. For 2 hours, the slave breaker and the young man grappled in the dirt of the barnyard. Frederick did not seek to kill, but he refused to be beaten. He held his ground with a strength born of desperation and reclaimed dignity. Covey, fearing for his reputation as a master of men, never laid a hand on him again. This physical victory was a resurrection of Frederick's soul. It was the moment he ceased to be a slave, in fact, even if he remained one in form. He had looked death and tyranny in the face and found that his spirit was unbreakable. Having reclaimed his sense of manhood in the struggle with Covey, Frederick returned to Baltimore, but the city could no longer contain his ambition. He was now a skilled ship caulker, earning wages that he was forced to hand over to his master, a practice he described as a refined form of robbery. In 1838, dressed in a sailor's uniform and carrying the protection papers of a free black seaman, he boarded a train headed north. The journey was a harrowing gauntlet of anxiety. A single suspicious glance from a conductor or a passenger could have sent him back to the gallows of the South. Yet by train and ferry, he bypassed the checkpoints of the slave states, eventually reaching the free soil of New York City. He was 20 years old, legally a fugitive, but for the first time in his life, his person belonged to himself. In the North, Frederick took the surname Douglass to evade slave catchers and settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He expected to find a bleak, impoverished landscape in a society without slaves. Instead, he was astonished by the prosperity and vigor of the Northern working class. He soon found himself drawn to the radical abolitionist circles led by William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator. When Douglass was invited to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket in 1841, he intended only to be a witness. But when he stood before the white audience, his voice, honed by years of secret reading and the rhythmic cadences of the Maryland woods, was a revelation. He did not speak as a victim. He spoke as a witness of undeniable intellectual power. His rise within the American Anti-Slavery Society was meteoric. He became a traveling lecturer, a fugitive who walked onto stages across the North to tell the story of his life. However, his eloquence became a liability. Critics began to doubt that a man so articulate and poised could ever have been an unlearned slave. They accused him of being an imposter, a freeborn black man coached by white abolitionists. To prove his identity and the reality of his suffering, Douglass took a massive risk. He wrote and published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book was a sensation, but it also acted as a beacon for his former masters. To avoid recapture under the Fugitive Slave Act, Douglass was forced to flee once again, not from the South, but from the United States itself, seeking temporary refuge across the Atlantic in Great Britain. Across the Atlantic, Frederick Douglass found a strange and exhilarating paradox. In the monarchies of Great Britain and Ireland, he felt more like a free man than he ever had in the American Republic. For 19 months, he traveled the British Isles, delivering hundreds of lectures to packed halls in cities like London, Edinburgh, and Dublin. The British public, already sensitized to the horrors of slavery, embraced him not as a curiosity, but as a statesman. In Ireland, he met the liberator Daniel O'Connell, whose struggle for Irish Catholic rights mirrored Douglass's own quest for Black liberation. This international journey expanded his worldview. He began to see the struggle for freedom not just as an American problem, but as a global movement for human rights, encompassing the plight of the poor, the disenfranchised, and the oppressed everywhere. Despite the warmth of his reception abroad, Douglass's status as a legal fugitive remained a looming shadow. To ensure he could return to his family in America without fear of the slave catchers, his British supporters raised $711 to officially purchase his freedom from Hugh Auld. For some radical abolitionists, this act was controversial. They argued that paying for a man's freedom recognized the legitimacy of the slaveholder's property claim. But for Douglass, the transaction was a pragmatic necessity. In April 1847, he returned to the United States as a man legally free in the eyes of the law, carrying with him the funds and the confidence to chart an independent course. Settling in Rochester, New York, Douglass broke ranks with his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, to launch his own newspaper, the North Star. He believed that for the movement to be successful, Black Americans had to be the architects of their own narrative. The newspaper's motto, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the father of us all, and we are all brethren," signaled a broadening of his activism. He became a staunch advocate for women's rights, famously being the only man to speak in favor of women's suffrage at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. As the 1850s dawned and the United States moved toward the precipice of civil war, Douglass's voice grew more militant. He realized that the moral suasion of the past was failing against the political might of the South. and he began to prepare his people and his country for the inevitable, violent reckoning that lay ahead. As the drums of war began to beat in 1861, Frederick Douglass saw the conflict not merely as a struggle for the Union, but as a fiery gospel that would finally purge the sin of slavery from the land. He became a relentless critic and advisor to President Abraham Lincoln, initially pushing the administration to move beyond its cautious preservation of the Union toward the total abolition of slavery. Douglass understood that the war could not be won without the participation of those most invested in its outcome. He famously declared, "The iron gate of our prison stands half open," and traveled the North as a recruiting agent for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the 1st Regiment of Black Soldiers. So two of his own sons were among the first to enlist, embodying his conviction that the right to use a musket was the prerequisite for the right to use a ballot. His relationship with Lincoln evolved from one of public friction to one of mutual respect. In their meetings at the White House, Douglass found a president who, though slow to act, was ultimately possessed of a deep-seated integrity. After the Emancipation Proclamation and the eventual Union victory, Douglass did not retire from the fray. He recognized that the formal end of slavery was only the beginning of the struggle for true citizenship. During the era of Reconstruction, he campaigned vigorously for the 14th and 15th Amendments, arguing that without the right to vote and the protection of the law, the formerly enslaved would remain in a state of serfdom. He became a symbol of Black political power, serving as a U.S. Marshal, the Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia, and eventually the U.S. Minister to Haiti. In his final years, Douglass resided at his estate, Cedar Hill, overlooking the Capitol. Known as the Sage of Anacostia, he remained a fiery orator even as his hair turned snow white. He watched with growing alarm as the gains of Reconstruction were dismantled by the rise of Jim Crow and the terror of lynching, using his final speeches to denounce the convict lease system and the betrayal. On February 20th, 1895, after attending a meeting of the National Council of Women, Frederick Douglass collapsed and died at his home. He had begun his life as a piece of property and ended it as one of the most photographed and influential men of the 19th century. His life stood as a living testament to the idea that the soul cannot be owned, and that the struggle for freedom is a journey without a final destination.